Welcome back to more Warhammer lore. In today's episode, we'll be delving back into the vampiric bloodlines once again, this time focusing on the Necrarchs, or the Necrarch Brotherhood as you may know them from the current Total War Warhammer 2. As always, I will be pulling this information from the latest army books as well as the Warhammer fantasy novels. The focus of this video will be the history and therefore origins of the Necrarchs, as well as what is the current state of their society, and of course their strengths and weaknesses. And now we will be once again retreading some ground with the origins, as by now you should all realize that they all were founded around the exact same time. But let's get into the lore proper, beginning with the founding of the Necrarch bloodline. Like all vampires, the Necrarch bloodline can be traced back to Lamia and Nehekara, and is the product of Neferata, the first vampire. One of the first men turned in her cabal of the Arisen was a man named Wusorin. Now, this will not be a full retelling of his story, but it will definitely hit all of the high notes as far as the history of the Necrarchs. He was a disgraced priest from Maharak, the city of priests and the Mecca for the Nehekaran people to commune amongst the many temples of the various cults of their pantheon. It is not exactly known what happened for him to be cast out from the city, but more than likely it was his obsession with power and a lack of self-control when it came to breaking taboos in the name of research and knowledge, something he would be pursuing as a member of the mortuary cult, though it is not specified which cult he was actually a part of. Now, something he would do many times to disastrous effects would be this forbidden research. Wusorin found himself in Lamia as a representative of the cults of the Nehekaran pantheon, and thus he held a rather considerable amount of power for a priest, as one of the few holy men in the city, and the only vampire with prior magical knowledge from his time as a priest, as the miracles and the rituals that they performed during the cult are actually magically based. So when Wusorin was turned, he found that he was much more magically attuned than he had been his entire life, and certainly the most attuned of all the vampires. And Neferata saw this as an opportunity to expand her influence and hopefully perfect the vampire's unlife as it was, foolishly giving Wusorin his own quarters for research and even allowing him to study the books of Nagash they had plundered from the Black Pyramid. Though through this his necromantic knowledge was greatly increased, and he was in fact the first vampire that I know of to actually raise the dead, but his lust for more power would be the undoing of all of his kind. You see, most of the book was written in a way that only Nagash and his chosen followers could translate. It was essentially a shorthand, and Wusorin had reached an impasse. He learned a great many things, but there was so much more at his fingertips if only he could somehow learn the secret of the great necromancers himself, learn how to read his shorthand, in fact. But sadly, he was killed, and his knowledge was lost. If Wusorin had been able to speak with him, he could have unlocked the secrets of these tomes. That is when a flicker of inspiration gave the vampire new hope. He was, in fact, a very powerful necromancer in his own right. Why not just call forth Nagash's soul and force it to give up its secrets? With a smile on his face, Wusorin began researching and experimenting with the summoning and binding of souls, much in the same way Nagash had done before. Unfortunately, Wusorin was forced to conduct his research in secret, as Neferata had made it known that they should sever all ties to the great necromancer and tread carefully with the mortals. This did not go over well with most of the cabal, but mostly this forced Wusorin to take much longer to grasp the concepts of binding souls, a fact that made him despise Neferata even more than before, as she had him focus on trivial matters, such as raising dead and trying to teach some of the others to do it as well, and perfecting the proper elixir of life, so that they would cure their thirst. This is something that he would eventually go on to continue as well, but for the time being, he felt it beneath himself. It was certainly a task unworthy of his talents, and after so many years, Wusorin finally was able to pull a soul from the realm of souls and bind it into the mortal world. Of course, this was but one step in the process, and summoning Nagash was proving to be very difficult. It was then that Ushoran, this is not Wusoran, this is Ushoran, the leader of what would become the Strigoi, barged in during one of his rituals. Wusoran contemplated smiting the fool with dark magic, but found himself in need of someone with Ushoran's talents, if he was ever going to contact Nagash. In fact, Ushoran even offered to help, if it would aid in toppling Neferata and freeing them from her human-loving ideals. It would be the pact between these co-conspirators that would spell the doom for Lamia and Neferata's kingdom. You see, Wusoran had Ushoran fetch the skull of Nagash's long-dead brother to aid in communing with the Great One, and it was from his tortured soul that they learned that Nagash was in fact still alive, and biding his time in the north at Cripple Peak, or what is now known as Nagashizar. With this knowledge, Wusoran wrote a letter to Nagash detailing the vampire coven in Lamia and how they would aid him in retaking his kingdom as his loyal servants. Another vampire was goaded into delivering this message, but sadly it would never reach its destination, as Al-Kadizar and his band of tribal horsemen intercepted this message and rallied the priest-kings of Nehekhara in an attack on Lamia, where it would inevitably be destroyed. Now, during this fight, Wusoran, whom was recently freed from a rather unpleasant punishment after the discovery of his treachery at the hands of Neferata, he was stuffed into a jar, essentially, for about 20 years with a stake through his heart. He was employed as a necromancer in her armies. Despite his misgivings about Neferata, Wusoran did relish the dark power he was able to wield unchecked by any concept of secrecy or hiding themselves. He and his new pupils raised armies of skeletons and zombies to resist the living, and very nearly would have stopped the sacking of Lamia if only a lucky shot from a catapult hadn't impacted on the very building Wusoran was casting from. He very nearly died in this instance, and with his break in concentration, his undead horde collapsed, and the living would eventually win the day because of this collapse. It was shortly after the cleansing of Lamia that Wusoran found himself in Nagashizar, having made the trip on foot with nowhere else really to go. To his surprise, Nagash not only lived, but had become a true lich at this point, and viewed all vampires as just another form of undead that he could control. Of course, he did take Wusoran as an apprentice, and greatly raised his understanding of not only necromancy, but the magic in general. Though he was not the only student, as the re-arisen Arkan the Black was also there learning at his master's feet. In fact, Wusoran quickly came to understand that Arkan was the only other sorcerer besides Nagash himself that could probably oppose him in power, and a bitter rivalry began, both trying to garnish more favor with Nagash, whom for his part could care less of the pointless games of his underlings. But this would definitely spell a certain distaste from Wusoran towards Arkan the Black. Wusoran was employed as a master necromancer in Nagash's armies when they would retake Nehekhara, a role he took rather well. Between himself and Arkan and the other vampires drawn to Nagash's horde, a mighty force was unleashed upon the kingdom of Khemri. But the new king, Al-Kadizar, ready for the coming of these monsters, beat them and drove them back into the north. Nagash, not being the most benevolent of masters, was rather upset at this loss, as well as the loss of most of his vampires at the hands of Vashanesh and his treachery. After this, Wusoran and a little later Ushoran would be the only vampires that stayed with the great necromancer as he underwent his next foray into Nehekhara and had the entire kingdom murdered through the poisoning of the River Vitae to ever be known as the River Mortis. Wusoran was sent away, as well as all of Nagash's other minions, as he underwent his great ritual. For his part, Wusoran begrudgingly obeyed, but was shocked when he felt the death of his master amongst the winds and the resurgence of the long-dead kings of Nehekhara, what would later become the Tomb Kings. In a desperate attempt to save himself, Wusoran was forced to flee the place of his birth, and he could not return to Cripple Peak as the Skaven had largely reclaimed it for themselves, and he was forced to seek shelter in the more remote places of the world. That is, until he felt the draw to Morcaine and the kingdom that Ushoran had established. The Necrarch was embraced as a brother by his longtime co-conspirator and given a place to not only conduct his research, but ample supplies of test subjects and access to any magical tomes that Ushoran had collected. It was nothing compared to the fortress of Nagashizar, but it was much better than the cave-dwelling existence he had put up with so far. Ushoran did, however, have stipulations to his stay. You see, the call all the vampires were experiencing that was emanating from Morcaine was actually coming from a specific tomb. Exactly the former king of the Strigos Empire before the arrival of Ushoran. Something old and dark was calling to them, Ushoran most of all, and he needed the Necrarch's magic to open up the tomb. Being just as fascinated with this disturbance, and the hold it seemed to have on him, Ushoran spent many years working out a way to open the crypt for the Strigoi, and in the meantime renewed his flesh experiments in an effort to create a weapon only he could wield if he would so need it. It is important to note that by this time, one of the effects of the Necrarch bloodline was beginning to take effect in Ushoran, and also in all of his disciples. Their bodies became withered and corpse-like despite their vampiric vitality, and they were not nearly as physically strong as any of the other bloodlines, though Ushoran was deceptively stronger than most. Though of course they would be much stronger than even the best humanity could offer, so they were by no means weak. But with a lack in the physical department and not trusting being able to smite any would-be vampire betrayals, especially that of Ushoran himself, or even the mighty Abarash, Ushoran's lapdog at this point, Ushoran would need something terrifying and strong to show he would not be tread over lightly as he was in Lamia. He found his answer deep under Morcaine in the crypts he had made his home. You see, after the collapse of Nagash's empire, the ghouls he had created scattered throughout the old world, and many tribes had taken up residence below Morcaine, probably drawn to the dark magic just as the vampires. Ghouls, while simple creatures, did make excellent test subjects, and through time and a little ingenuity, Ushoran created his first weapon. Though the capture and study of ghouls, he found that their physiology was affected by what they ate, and so he offered them vampiric blood. Now, he did not give them the blood kiss. No, even he would not allow such a base creature to have that much power. He simply disposed of unwanted vampires from the Strigos Empire, and more than likely a few assistants went missing. But select ghouls were allowed to eat the flesh of the vampires, and a surprising change happened. The ghouls nearly tripled in size, towering easily over 8 feet tall. Their musculature increased, and they seemed to be able to heal wounds quickly. But this change was not only physical, as they were no longer shy, skittish creatures, but thirsty for more vampiric blood and filled with rage. If you can't guess, Ushoran was the first to create and domesticate what we know as crypt horrors, and he employed them as bodyguards and essentially assassins to dispose of rivals and smug vampires that thought him an easy mark. Of course, this is not all Ushoran would come to create. In fact, many strides were made in necromancy, or should I say, rediscovered after the defeat of Nagash, and he continually experimented with his flesh constructs and various other little pet projects of his own, mostly involving vampires and their nature during his time at Morcaine. However, all that would change when he finally managed to open the crypt for Ushoran. You see, the crypt was actually the resting place of the Crown of Sorcery, Nagash's very own crown. It was taken there by Al-Khadizar before his death at the hands of Fellblade and sealed away. But to Ushoran's surprise, when he saw the artifact, he knew its true purpose. In fact, he had done something similar to a barbarian tribe to the north of Morcaine. created a crown by binding his own malevolent essence into the object, which then would feed on the wearer and force them to obey the will of the one who made it. In this case, the crown of sorcery, when Ushoran put it upon his head, despite the warnings of Wusoran, it took over the Stragoy's body, and Wusoran saw without a doubt the image of Nagash back in the mortal realm, here to exert his will once more over the undead he saw beneath him. But Wusoran had had enough of obeying others, and quickly fled, as he knew he was no match for this new incarnation of Nagash. Yet, even if it was just a fragment of the necromancer that had taken over Ushoran. And so Wusoran fled with another deemed rebel, Strigoi, the infamous ghoul king known as Vorag Bloodytooth, under the orders of Neferata, whom was leading a small resistance against the now resurgent Nagash. The Bloodytooth was a prime example of his kind, a brute, but a powerful one at that, and through cunning and manipulation, Wusoran claimed a fortress for the Strigoi in the mountains bordering the Darklands, and then quickly took it over for himself once said Strigoi left on another pilgrimage, though they had to remove the previous occupants, that being the ever-lovable Skaven. In fact, it was through his interactions with the children of the Horned Rat that Wusoran made several advances in his own spellcraft. One specific instance was when he witnessed a Grey Seer eat Warpstone to summon raw power that even rivaled his own. Though Warpstone was known to him, as it was a crux of a kind for his previous master, he did not think that actually consuming the stuff was even possible without succumbing to hideous mutations. And thus, through the capture of a warlock engineer, the extent of Warpstone was tested and found to be rather useful to the Necrarch's flesh experiments. In addition to this, Wusoran, after being forced to eat some of this very substance in a desperate situation, found that he no longer had a thirst for blood after its consumption for quite some time, though he was scared of what effects it would have in the long run, and only utilized it to amplify his abilities when he needed. Though if you know anything about Grey Seers and their abuse of this stuff, you can see that an addiction is associated with it, and it has the exact same effect on vampires, apparently. You see, much like many vampires, Wusoran was in fact looking for a way to cure his red thirst, his need for blood. This was more of a practical consideration for his part, as how can he complete his projects and experiments with the constant agonizing need for blood stifling his creative juices. And through his trials with Warpstone, he found that he could take in vast quantities of dark magic and do the same at a more safe amount, well as safe as dark magic can be. And he may have already known this, as he did not need to feed as regularly as others of his kind, but this was certainly the moment that he came to the conclusion that he could supplement his need for blood with that of raw magic. Now, from here, Wusoran went on to murder and maim the lovable Skaven for a few decades as they tried to retake their hold, all the while furthering his scientific knowledge by bleeding information from the warlock engineer he kept captive and the various weapons and schematics left behind after the Skaven's retreat. In fact, this environment allowed him to test many of his new pet projects, the crypt ghouls chief amongst them, but also the extent of his necromantic powers and the abominations he was brewing in one of the many flesh laboratories. After some time, however, he was forced into action and had to abandon his hold due to the treachery of the other bloodlines, no less, and even led one of the more successful results against the current reincarnation of Nagash in Strigos. This is the crown of sorcery I'm talking about, not an actual rebirth of the necromancer, because that would take place a few hundred years from now in the timeline. But Wusoran managed to summon vast hordes of zombies and skeletons, and the various abominations he perfected in his war with the Skaven was proven too much for the defenders of Morkane to handle. Mostly because the puppet Ushoran was not present, and also because many of the nation's armies were busy dealing with the encroaching greenskin invasion that Neferata had orchestrated to level the capital. He came eerily close, that is Wusoran, to toppling the city, but ultimately he would find no counter for the mighty Abarash, the leader of the Blood Dragons, whom single-handedly slew the Necrarch's zombie dragon mount in single combat. A feat made even more impressive because at this point in time he had not yet drank from the dragon that would give him his namesake, meaning this was just his power before he had infused himself with the spirit of the dragon. However, despite losing the pitched battle, Wusoren was allowed to challenge Ushoren to combat, and he lost. Despite all of his bravado, despite the warp stone, he could not beat just the sliver of Nagash controlling Ushoren in magical combat, and he fled, which is actually, if you've seen the trend, it's one of the things he does best. It's something that would characterize those of his bloodline. And now we are getting into where you can find Wusoren today. Well, that's actually slightly more complicated than you would think. You see, after his defeat in Strigos, Wusoren retreated into the mountains alone with maybe a handful of apprentices and decided that he would just rather stay under the radar, away from the feud between the other bloodlines for dominance. He was beaten in more ways than one, and simply wanted to study in peace and chafed after his compulsions for knowledge and power. His time would come one day, but until then he would take a tab from Ushoren's book and keep out of sight and out of mind. He did this for a few hundred years until one of his old disciples caught up with him, and this is after the fall of Morcaine by the Greenskins. His disciple's name was Melchior. Now, Melchior is also a very famous Necrarch character in the lore. At least that is what we are led to believe. Because you see, one of the curses of being a Necrarch is that their bodies are warped from the lack of feeding and the use of powerful dark magic. And in fact, they appear to undergo an aging process. Though this is nothing like what happens to humans, it is much slower, but it still happens, and Wusoren, inspired by what his former master was doing with his Black Pyramid, and his knowledge of how he placed pieces of himself in the inanimate objects that he forged, he began studying how to tether his soul, or what passes as his consciousness, I guess, since he may not even have a soul, in vampiric form, from his body and summoned into another. Of course, it would have to be a very similar vessel he would need to inhabit, and preferably someone close to himself in the family tree, or at the very least of his own bloodline. Thus did Melchior's desire to attain more power and surpass his master doom himself. You see, there is another aspect of vampiric culture, or I may have forgotten to add. So you see, a vampire absorbs the life essence of those it drains, and thus it is true of all creatures that it drains, which is why they should not drink from something that would be tainted, as they would be drawing the taint into themselves. A good example would be drinking from a dwarf, as they are magically resistant, and their blood, therefore, can actually be drank, because vampires have before, but it is likely to make the vampire sick for a time, or at least until they can wash it down with something else. However, the opposite is true of powerful beings. For instance, this is how Abarash gains his abilities after draining the dragon, that he does not need to drink blood, and he also gained ridiculous strength as well. And in the same fashion, a vampire can actually drink from another vampire and absorb their strength, their unholy vigor. This is how a younger vampire can surpass an elder, who simply by age are usually more powerful. Melchior drained Wusoren dry in what he thought was a defining moment in his life, only to find out that Wusoren let him drink him, and through his blood he was able to transfer himself into Melchior's vessel, in which the Necrarch essentially banished, or more likely ate, the being that was Melchior, his consciousness, and took control of his body. So everything that was attributed to Melchior after this act should actually be attributed to Wusoren. And this did happen again later on with Zacharias, the Ever-Living, whom in turn drained Melchior, his master, or Wusorin if you're getting what I'm putting down. So anyways, and therefore Wusorin, who may or may not have been Zacharias, kind of, as I said, it's complicated. So this makes the Necrarch bloodline one of only 2 bloodlines that does not technically have its founder leading them currently, though in reality he is actually still around and nobody knows because he has been putting on an act. He's actually become quite the actor when it comes to playing the parts of his disciples as he inhabits them. And now would be a good time to transition into Necrarch society as it is today. This will be rather short, as with much like the Strigoi, they are very few and far between. In fact, they may be the least numerous of all the bloodlines, as they are prone to isolation and distrust of everyone, including any vampires they might even sire. Due to their appearance, they can't fit into human society, though they are powerful enough sorcerers that they could disguise themselves, but that would go against their very nature. They find themselves superior to all things, as all Necrarchs are very proud. They do think of themselves as each one of them thinks they are the greatest of their kind, and those who sired them to be imbeciles and unworthy of commanding them. For this may in fact be the curse of the Necrarch, much like what happened to Wusorin. Every apprentice, always, at some point in a time, will attempt to kill their master. It is inevitable. It is simply a win, which is why they are so distrustful of others. For if they can't even trust their gets, surely they cannot trust an outsider. Now, Necrarchs tend to live, for this reason, in secluded towers and caves, usually in some high place where they can be closer to the winds of magic. For they are most in touch with the winds of magic than any other bloodline. In fact, it is one of their defining traits, but we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves there. In addition to living in secluded areas, Necrarchs tend to draw to themselves the mutants and outcasts of human society. This is no wish of their own. For some odd reason, much in the same way ghouls are drawn to the Strigoi, mutants tend to form camps around Necrarch strongholds, which is actually a good thing for these vampires, as it makes it easier for them to perform experiments as well as attain fresh blood, which they only need every few years depending upon their age. Though it is of note that when they are first sired, they drink the same amount of blood as a normal vampire. It's just over time, as the traits of the bloodline begin to kick in, do they kind of start to taper off. Now, these mutants are often employed in the Necrarch armies, though Necrarchs don't tend to go to all-out war to conquer land or claim dominion, but they do raise undead armies and train mutants in necromancy in order to obtain knowledge or some magical trinkets. In fact, these vampires are very fond of books, of course, and arcane sorceries, and are where you can find the most gathered dark knowledge, probably outside of Nagashizar and the remnants of the Dark Necromancer's followers. This also makes employing necromancers a very easy task for the Necrarchs, as they are naturally drawn towards this knowledge and the promise of the Necrarch's tutelage, and if they are lucky, or unlucky in this case, the blood kiss. Now would be a good segue into the strengths and weaknesses of the Necrarch bloodline. Now, as far as weaknesses are concerned, many are readily apparent just from their appearance. Necrarchs are damn near skeletons. They're often hunched over and frail. They look decayed, though they have more than enough strength to outclass any human, and speed that you would not expect from something so fragile looking. They also do not have a reflection, much like all vampires, though they probably never notice, as it would not be that important to them anyway. They are affected by the sun the same way as other vampires, though with them being powerful mages, they can easily shield themselves from the harshest of its rays, and are known to blot out the sun with magical illusions so as to eliminate one last distraction from their work. Which leads us into their mental state. That they are very weak physically, but also, you see, All Necrarchs suffer from some kind of compulsion, whether that be a desire to attain more knowledge or to hoard magical artifacts, or perhaps even both. They are prone to insanity, as the dark magic they infuse their bodies has a tad bit of a warping effect on their mind, as well as since they spend years or even centuries alone, it's not uncommon for a Necrarch to have something similar to a split personality, or talking to people or things that are not actually there in the physical world. This makes them very hard to approach, and even puts off other vampires that otherwise would at least deal with them for their necromantic skills and dark knowledge. Which leads us into their strengths. As I said earlier, the Necrarchs are the most formidable of the bloodlines in magical skill. They would be on par with the youngest of the elves, or possibly even the skink priests of the lizardmen. Of course, I'm not talking about the veteran magic users of the High and Dark Elves, or even the Slan, but they could easily challenge the casters, anything the human race could produce, or even the lich priests of the Tomb Kings. I would find them probably superior. Though they do fall short in the physical department, and tend to engage in battles from afar, and preferably with plenty of chaff between themselves and their opponents. Another strength, or should I say hobby, of most Necrarchs is divination. In fact, it is a regular practice for these vampires, and is another reason why they seem to be so prone to mind-shattering schisms, and yet ahead of any would-be vampire hunter. They literally spend quite a bit of their time seeing into the future, and if you know anything about divining the future in the Warhammer world, it is very dangerous, as more often than not, what you are seeing may come to pass regardless of what you do, or it may possibly be revealed to you in half-truths, as the forces of chaos have often influenced these divinations and skewed them in their favor, pitting seers against each other or taking them away from objectives that could foil their schemes. This is even so more true of the Necrarchs, as despite their appearance and acts, vampires in general do not actually side with chaos, as they are too proud to be ruled over. So many methods are employed to keep them busy or hunted, which could be true of most vampires in general. Oh, and one more strength of the Necrarchs before we move on is that they have an attuned sight to the winds of magic. This is often known as mage sight to magic users in general, but the Necrarchs are so attuned that it actually appears more vibrant and real to them than that of the physical world, making them very, very excellent mage hunters because they can pick them out of a crowd. This also may be another reason why they often lose their minds, as they are essentially seen into the spirit worlds and therefore the realms of chaos as clearly as you or I can see the sky. Oh yes, and I almost forgot. Unlike many of the other bloodlines, the Necrarchs are one of the few that do not actually change form, meaning that they do not tend to shapeshift or embrace their inner beast, as their beast has long ago been starved out, as they do not feed often enough. But many Necrarchs have been known to employ sorcery to turn into many animals such as crows, or simply dissolve themselves into mist to escape harm. Their magical prowess is not to be underestimated. And with that, I am actually ending this lore video on the Necrarch Brotherhood. They are a fascinating bloodline in my opinion, one of my favorites actually of the vampires. They really embody the undead sorcerer, but with a twist. And in many ways they remind me of the Sith, in that the apprentice always kills the master, ensuring that the newest generation is the strongest, and also limiting their numbers in turn. Now, I do hope that you learned something new, and if you have any questions on the Necrarchs, feel free to drop them in the comment section and I will do my best to answer them accordingly. I would also like to take this time to say thank you to all of my loyal subscribers in the Cult of Thick, and all of my new followers. If you're not either, then feel free to both like this video and subscribe to the channel. I try to add a lore video about once a week, and the thumbs up will help me get the word out to others that may want to enjoy this content. As always guys, I have been Jumbo Thick. thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Have a good day.